Well, hello, and welcome to this session. What I'm going to talk about is a step within the business continuity program that may not be widely done by organisations, and that's what I call the threat and vulnerability analysis. What I advocate that we do as part of our business continuity process is identify a range of threats to the critical business function that we have identified during our business impact analysis. So we take our critical business function, identify the threats to the continued operation of that function, and then what we do is we identify how vulnerable we are to that particular threat for that business continuity function. Now, the neat thing about this is if we identify the vulnerabilities to those particular threats, we can start to reduce the vulnerability to those beforehand. I'll give you an example. So let's say we've got a building that has it's all of its IT systems in the basement and it's in a floodplain. So the continued operation of our IT is a critical business function. If we look at the threats, flood would be one of those. We would then ask the question, how vulnerable are we to that? Well, the answer there is that we're very vulnerable or extremely vulnerable due to our location. And as a result of that, we could then make an assessment as to whether we reduce the vulnerability to that threat by potentially moving our ICT servers to higher ground, i.e. on the first, second or third floor. And by doing that, not only have we reduced the vulnerability, we have reduced the likelihood that that critical business function is going to be disrupted during a flood event. Now, if we look at something like the Fukushima meltdown or the Fukushima nuclear plant, they actually had a whole range. They had something like 16 backup generators because the loss of power in a nuclear plant is catastrophic. All 16 of those backup generators were underground. So when the tsunami actually breached the wall the seawall that they'd put in place, which could cope with a 6-metre tsunami as opposed to a 15-metre tsunami, which is what they got, every single one of those backup generators was inundated with that flooding. As a result, there was no power, and you've seen the consequences of that. It took over 2 weeks to restore power to the Fukushima plant. And as a result, we still have contaminated water going into the Pacific Ocean in large rates huge magnitudes on every day. Now, what was really interesting about that story was that only a few months before, or a couple of years before that event, the chief executive officer of the company that ran it said there was 0% probability that they would ever see a tsunami event that would breach the 6-metre seawall. Funnily enough, well, not funny, it happened. So I've talked a little bit about before with this cultural thing about this will never happen versus what happens if. The question that they should have been asking, or not, the thing they shouldn't have been asking is what happens if it does breach the wall, not saying this will never happen. If you're saying that in your business or in your government department, well, this will never happen, well, I'm sorry, it probably will. And history is littered with those black swans that we've previously talked about that were never supposed to happen, but did. So, what I'm advocating is identify your critical business functions, think about all of the threats to the continued function of that critical business function, and then look at the vulnerability to that. And if you can reduce the vulnerability ahead of time, then the likelihood that you're going to see the consequence of losing that function is greatly reduced. If we take it back to Fukushima, if they had have said, what happens if it does go above the 6-metre wall? Well, they're going to get inundated. So how can we reduce the vulnerability to that during the design? Well, rather than having them underground, we might have them at a higher ground. And that way, we know that we're not going to get inundated with water. It's a different way of looking at it, but it's all about proactively reducing your vulnerability to those particular events or those threats. I hope that's been helpful for you. And as always, let's be careful out there.